Lorenzo Valenti governed Chicago's underworld with a calculator instead of a heart, enforcing order through silence louder than any gunshot. On a rainy November Tuesday inside the Obsidian's exclusive VIP room, he replaced standard interrogation methods with a glass of water and a loaded Glock 19. While his toughest henchmen sweated through their suits, Sarah, a 23-year-old waitress, did not just survive his loyalty test. She humiliated him with absolute, unnerving calm. That single moment of defiance sparked a brutal war that would bring the city to its knees. This is the true story of the waitress who didn't flinch. The Obsidian wasn't just a nightclub. It was a fortress wrapped in velvet and polished brass, sitting ominously on the edge of the Chicago River. To the public, it was where the city's elite came to burn money. To the Chicago Police Department, it was a black hole where evidence disappeared. And to Sarah Miller, it was just the only place in the city that paid enough in tips to cover her grandmother's dialysis bills. Sarah was 23, with hair the color of dried wheat and eyes that had seen too much for her age. She wasn't the type of girl who dreamed of being saved. She was the type who knew exactly where the fire exits were in every room she entered. She kept her head down, her apron clean, and her mouth shut. That was the golden rule at the Obsidian. See everything, say nothing. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday. The club was throbbing with a deep bass line, but the VIP section, a raised platform separated by soundproof glass, was dead silent. "Table 1 is yours tonight, Miller," the floor manager, a sweaty man named Greg, hissed as he shoved a tray into her hands. His hands were shaking. "Don't screw it up. Enzo is in a mood." Sarah felt a cold prickle at the base of her spine. She didn't need to ask who Enzo was. Lorenzo Enzo Valenti, the head of the Valenti crime family. He didn't come to the Obsidian to party. He came to conduct business that couldn't be discussed over phone lines. "I'll handle it," Sarah said, her voice steady, though her grip on the tray tightened. She pushed through the heavy oak doors into the VIP suite. The air inside was thick, smelling of expensive leather, stale fear, and Davidoff cigar smoke. There were 6 men in the room. 5 of them were standing, their hands hovering near the bulges in their jackets. Only 1 was sitting. Lorenzo Valenti looked more like a Wall Street shark than a mobster, but the eyes gave him away. They were dark, almost black, and completely devoid of warmth. He was wearing a charcoal 3-piece suit that probably cost more than Sarah's entire education. He didn't look up when she entered. He was busy staring at a man kneeling on the floor in front of him, a man Sarah recognized as a low-level dealer named Ricky. Ricky was crying. "Please, Mr. Valenti," Ricky sobbed, snot running down his nose. "I didn't talk to the feds. I swear on my mother's eyes, I didn't talk." Sarah stopped 5 feet away. In any other job, you would turn around and run. You would call 911. But Sarah knew that if she turned around now, she'd never make it to the exit. The rule was simple. You are furniture. You are invisible. She walked forward, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence. One of the standing men, a brute named Marco, with a scar running through his eyebrow, stepped in her path. "Not now, sweetheart. Get lost." Lorenzo raised a single hand. Marco froze. "Let her pass," Lorenzo said. His voice was a low baritone, smooth like aged whiskey, but burning on the way down. He finally looked up, his gaze bypassing the sobbing man on the floor to lock onto Sarah. "I'm thirsty." Sarah didn't look at the crying man. She didn't look at the guns. She looked Lorenzo Valenti dead in the eye. "Sparkling or still, Mr. Valenti?" she asked. The room went silent. The audacity of the question hung in the air. A man was begging for his life, and she was asking about water preferences. Lorenzo's lips twitched, a micro-expression. Amusement? Or annoyance? "Still," he said, "with 3 cubes of ice. Not 4. Not 2. "Coming right up," she said. She turned her back on the most dangerous man in Chicago and walked to the bar in the corner of the suite. Her hands didn't shake as she used the silver tongs to place exactly 3 cubes into a crystal tumbler. She poured the water. She placed it on a small serving tray. When she turned back, Lorenzo had a gun in his hand. A matte black pistol. He was pointing it at Ricky's head. "Last chance, Ricky," Lorenzo said softly. "I swear, boss, I swear." Bang! The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Ricky collapsed. Most people would scream. Most people would drop the tray. Sarah didn't. She walked over to the table, stepped carefully over Ricky's legs as if he were a pile of laundry, and set the glass down on the coaster next to Lorenzo's hand. "Your water, sir," she said. "Will there be anything else?" Lorenzo didn't look at the body. He stared at Sarah. For the first time all night, he looked genuinely surprised. He picked up the glass, took a sip, and never broke eye contact. "You didn't flinch," he observed. "I have a job to do, Mr. Valenti," Sarah replied. "So do you." "Clean this up," Lorenzo barked at Marco, gesturing to the body. Then he leaned back, studying Sarah like she was a puzzle he hadn't solved yet. "What's your name?" "Sarah. Sarah," he repeated, tasting the name. "You're not afraid of me, Sarah." "Fear doesn't pay my rent, sir." Lorenzo laughed. It was a dark, dry sound. "Get out, before I decide you saw too much." Sarah nodded, turned, and walked out. She made it to the locker room before her knees gave out. She slid down the wall, hyperventilating, pressing her hands into the cold tile floor to stop the shaking. She had survived. But she didn't know that she had just failed the test by passing it. Lorenzo Valenti didn't like puzzles he couldn't solve, and he had just decided that Sarah Miller was his new project. 3 days passed. Sarah tried to convince herself that Tuesday night was a hallucination. She focused on her routine, nursing school classes in the morning, sleeping in the afternoon, working at the Obsidian at night. She avoided the news, terrified she'd see a report about a body found in the river. On Friday night, the club was busier than usual. A bachelor party was raging near the bar, and the air was thick with cheap cologne and desperation. Sarah was carrying a tray of tequila shots when Greg, the manager, grabbed her arm. "VIP again," Greg said, looking paler than usual. "He asked for you specifically." "Who?" Sarah asked, though she already knew. "Valenti. He's got the whole North Side crew with him. Go." Sarah took a deep breath. She adjusted her apron and headed up the stairs. She told herself she was just a waitress. If she acted like a waitress, she'd be safe. When she entered the suite this time, the vibe was different. It wasn't an execution. It was a party. Or at least a mafia version of a party. There were beautiful women in expensive dresses draped over the sofas, men laughing loudly, and bottles of Ace of Spades champagne everywhere. Lorenzo was sitting at the head of the main table looking bored. He was playing with a lighter, flipping the lid open and closed. Clink, clink, clink. When Sarah approached the table, the conversation died down. The men, Marco, a slimy guy named Silas, and an older consigliere named Giovanni, all watched her. They remembered Tuesday. "Sarah," Lorenzo said, not looking up from the lighter. "You're late." "I have other tables, Mr. Valenti," she said, setting down fresh glasses. "Not anymore. Tonight, you belong to this table." He gestured to the empty seat next to him. "Sit." It wasn't a request. "I can't sit with customers, sir. It's against policy." "I own the building," Lorenzo said, finally looking at her. "I own the policy. Sit." Sarah hesitated, then sat on the edge of the leather sofa, keeping a respectable distance. "Everyone," Lorenzo announced to the room, his voice cutting through the chatter. "This is the girl I told you about, the one with ice in her veins." The men laughed. One of the women, a brunette with sharp eyes, glared at Sarah. "She looks like a stiff breeze would knock her over," Marco sneered. "Let's test that," Lorenzo said. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a heavy silver revolver. He opened the cylinder, emptied the bullets onto the glass table, and picked up a single round. He slid it back into the chamber and spun the cylinder. Whir, click, Russian roulette. The room went deathly still. The music from downstairs thumped through the floor, a dull heartbeat. "Here is the game," Lorenzo said, sliding the gun across the table toward Sarah. It spun and stopped with the barrel pointing at her chest. "You want a tip tonight? Pick it up, point it at the wall, pull the trigger. If it clicks, you get $5,000. If it bangs, well, I'll pay for your funeral." Sarah looked at the gun. It was a test of obedience, or maybe a test of stupidity. "And if I refuse?" she asked quietly. "Then you walk out of here, and you never come back. You lose the job, and I make sure no one in Chicago hires you, not even a diner." Sarah thought about her grandmother. The dialysis treatments were $3,000 a month. She was 2 months behind. If she lost this job, her grandmother died. It was that simple. She looked at Lorenzo. He was watching her with that same intense curiosity. He wanted to see her break. He wanted to see her cry like Ricky. Sarah reached out and picked up the gun. It was heavy, cold steel. Her hand trembled slightly, then steadied. She didn't point it at the wall. She stood up, walked over to Lorenzo, and placed the muzzle of the gun against his forehead. The room exploded. "Don't move!" Marco screamed, leveling his own weapon at her. 3 other guns were instantly trained on Sarah's head. Lorenzo didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He stared up at her, the cold circle of the barrel pressed between his eyes. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. "You have a death wish, Piccola?" he whispered. "You said the game was to pull the trigger," Sarah said, her voice trembling just a fraction, betraying the adrenaline flooding her system. "You didn't say I had to shoot the wall. You're the one who threatened my livelihood. If I'm going to gamble with my life, I'm taking the house down with me." The silence stretched, tight as a violin string about to snap. Marco's finger was whitening on the trigger of his Glock. One word from Lorenzo, and Sarah would be missed. "Put the guns down," Lorenzo ordered, his eyes never leaving Sarah's. "Boss, she's got a piece on you," Marco yelled. "I said put them down," Lorenzo roared. Reluctantly, the men lowered their weapons. "Go ahead," Lorenzo said softly to Sarah. "Pull it. Let's see who Destiny likes more today. You or me?" Sarah's finger tightened on the trigger. She calculated the odds. 1 in 6. Click. The hammer fell on an empty chamber. Sarah exhaled, a ragged breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She lowered the gun and set it back on the table. "That's $5,000, she said. "Cash." Lorenzo stared at her for a long moment. Then he threw his head back and laughed, a genuine, loud laugh that shook his shoulders. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a thick stack of bills and tossed them onto the table. "Give her 10, Lorenzo said to Marco, "and get her a drink. She's not a waitress anymore." He looked at Sarah, his eyes shining with a dark, possessive light. "You passed," he said. "Now the real work begins." Sarah took the money. She knew she should run. She knew she had just walked into the lion's den and slapped the lion. But as she looked at Lorenzo Valenti, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't just scared, she was exhilarated, and Lorenzo knew it. The money sat on Sarah's kitchen table like a radioactive brick, $10,000 in used hundreds, wrapped in a rubber band. It was enough to pay for 3 months of her grandmother's dialysis, plus rent on their crumbling 2-bedroom apartment in Cicero, just outside the city limits. It was 4 a.m. Sarah hadn't slept. She was scrubbing her hands in the sink, the water scalding hot, scrubbing until her skin was raw and pink. She couldn't wash off the sensation of the cold steel trigger against her finger. "Sarah?" The voice was weak, raspy. Sarah froze, turned off the tap, and dried her hands on a dish towel. She walked into the living room, which had been converted into a makeshift hospital room. A hospital bed took up most of the space, surrounded by whirring machines and tangles of plastic tubing. Grandma Rose was awake, her skin the color of old parchment. "I'm here, Gram," Sarah whispered, sitting on the edge of the bed. You smell like smoke, Rose murmured, her eyes clouded with cataracts. And expensive cologne. Trouble? No trouble, Sarah lied smoothly. Just extra shifts. Big tippers tonight. Rose gripped Sarah's hand with surprising strength. You have your father's hand, Sarah. Steady. Too steady. Be careful. The quiet ones, they're the ones the devil watches. Sarah stiffened. Her grandmother didn't know the half of it. The truth was, Sarah Miller didn't exist. Her birth name was Serafina Moretti, the estranged daughter of a freelance cleaner who used to scrub crime scenes for the highest bidder in the 90s. Her father hadn't taught her how to ride a bike. He had taught her which household chemicals removed blood from grout and how to spot a liar by the vein throbbing in their neck. He had been murdered when she was 12, a loose end tied up by an unknown employer. Sarah had spent the last decade hiding, pretending to be a nobody, but Lorenzo Valenti had seen through the mask. The next evening, Sarah didn't go to the Obsidian. She received a text message on her burner phone at 6 p.m., no number, just an address and a time, the Palmer House, Hilton, Penthouse Suite, 8 p.m. Wear the black dress. A box had been left at her doorstep. Inside was a black silk gown, sleek and backless, with a pair of Jimmy Choo heels that cost more than her car. Sarah debated running. She could pack the car, grab her grandmother, and drive until the gas ran out. But Lorenzo Valenti had resources. If she ran, he would hunt her. If she went, she might survive. She put on the dress. It fit perfectly, a terrifying detail that meant he had been watching her long enough to know her measurements. At 8 p.m. sharp, a black Lincoln Navigator idled outside her building. The driver was Marco, the scarred brute from the club. "Get in," Marco grunted, not opening the door for her. The ride to downtown Chicago was silent. Marco watched her in the rear-view mirror, his eyes filled with suspicion. He knew she had held a gun to his boss's head, and he couldn't understand why she was still breathing. When they arrived at the Palmer House, Marco escorted her through the service elevator, bypassing the lobby. They went straight to the top. The penthouse was a sprawling masterpiece of gold leaf and velvet. Lorenzo was standing by the window, looking out at the city lights. He held a glass of scotch in one hand and a dossier in the other. "Serafina," he said, without turning around. Sarah stopped in the middle of the room. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of boredom. "My name is Sarah. Your name is whatever I say it is." Lorenzo turned. He dropped the dossier on the coffee table. It fanned open. Photos of her father. Photos of the crime scene where he died. Photos of Sarah, at 12 years old, covered in dust. "Your father was Arthur the janitor Moretti," Lorenzo said, walking toward her. "The best cleaner in the Midwest. He could make a massacre look like a tea party. Legend has it. He taught his little girl the trade." "He taught me how to survive," Sarah said, cold why. "Something you seem determined to make difficult." "I don't want you to clean for me, Sarah." Lorenzo stopped inches from her. The scent of sandalwood and danger radiated off him. "I have men for that. I have Marco." "Then what do you want?" "I want your eyes." Lorenzo circled her. "You walked into a room with a dead body and a man with a gun, and you noticed that I wanted 3 ice cubes. You noticed the details while everyone else was focused on the blood. That is a rare talent. In my world, people panic. They miss things. You don't." He stopped in front of her again, his dark eyes boring into hers. "I have a meeting tonight, a negotiation with the Kovac syndicate. The Russians, they are unpredictable. I need someone who isn't one of my soldiers, someone they won't look at twice, a pretty girl on my arm. You want me to be a prop? I want you to be a spy," Lorenzo corrected. "I want you to watch their hands, watch their eyes, watch the exits. If you see something wrong, you tell me. If you save my life, I clear your grandmother's medical debt. Permanently. I'll move her to a private clinic in Switzerland if I have to." Sarah's breath caught. It was the one offer she couldn't refuse. "And if I die?" "Then I'll pay for a very nice headstone," Lorenzo smirked. He held out his arm. "Shall we?" Sarah looked at his arm, then at the dossier on the table. She was stepping off a cliff, and she knew it. But for the first time in her life, she felt like she was stepping toward her destiny rather than running from it. She took his arm. "3 ice cubes, Mr. Valenti. Don't forget." The venue was the Art Institute of Chicago, rented out for a private charity gala that was essentially a summit for the city's criminal underground. The cover story was a fundraiser for orphanages, which was ironic, considering how many orphans the men in this room had created. The air was filled with the sound of a string quartet playing Vivaldi and the clink of champagne flutes. But underneath the civility, the tension was thick enough to choke on. The room was divided. On the left, the Italian families, led by the Valentis. On the right, the Kovac Syndicate, a brutal Russian organization that had been encroaching on the South Side heroin trade. Lorenzo moved through the crowd like a shark in a koi pond. He smiled, shook hands, and exchanged pleasantries, but his left hand never left the small of Sarah's back. It felt less like an embrace and more like he was steering a weapon. "Smile," he whispered in her ear. "You look like you're at a funeral." "Maybe I am," Sarah muttered, scanning the room. She went into work mode. It was a state of mind her father had taught her. Detach, observe, catalogue. She ignored the diamonds and the silk ties. She looked for the bulges under jackets. She looked for the exits. She looked for the staff. "That's Nikolai Kovac," Lorenzo said quietly, nodding toward a massive man near the sculpture exhibit. Nikolai looked like a bear shaved into a tuxedo. He had a thick neck, hands the size of shovels, and a smile that didn't reach his pale blue eyes. He was surrounded by 4 bodyguards who looked like they were carved out of granite. "Lorenzo!" Nikolai boomed, his voice carrying over the music. He opened his arms wide. "My friend, you bring beauty to the beast's den, yes?" Lorenzo stepped forward, pulling Sarah with him. "Nikolai, this is Sarah." Nikolai grabbed Sarah's hand and kissed it. His lips were wet and cold. "Charmed. You're very brave, little flower, to be with this wolf." "I like wolves," Sarah said, pulling her hand back slowly. "They're loyal." Nikolai laughed, but his eyes narrowed. "Loyalty is expensive, darling. Sometimes too expensive." The 2 bosses moved to a private table near the balcony, ostensibly to discuss territory boundaries. Sarah sat next to Lorenzo, sipping a glass of water. No ice this time. As the men spoke in coded metaphors about distribution channels and shipping lanes, Sarah let her gaze drift. She scanned the room. She watched the waiters. There was a rhythm to service. Pour, turn, step, retreat. Pour, turn, step, retreat. Her eyes landed on a waiter servicing the Kovac side of the table. He was young, blonde, with a nervous tick in his jaw. He was carrying a bottle of vintage Pinot Noir. He approached Nikolai's glass. He poured perfectly. Then he approached Lorenzo's glass. Sarah frowned. The waiter's grip on the bottle changed. His index finger slid down the neck of the bottle, covering the label. It was a subtle shift, something a normal person would miss. But Sarah knew about mechanics. She knew about leverage, and she noticed his shoes. All the waiters were wearing standard-issue polished dress shoes. This waiter was wearing rubber-soled tactical boots, with the logos blacked out with marker. He needs traction, Sarah realized. He's not planning to walk away. He's planning to run. The waiter leaned in to pour Lorenzo's wine. His other hand, hidden behind his back under a napkin, twitched. Time seemed to slow down. Lorenzo was busy staring down Nikolai, locked in a verbal spar about union contracts. He didn't see the waiter. Sarah didn't think. She didn't scream. Screaming wasted time. Just as the waiter's hidden hand whipped out from behind the napkin, revealing a ceramic knife, invisible to metal detectors, Sarah moved. She grabbed the heavy crystal water pitcher from the center of the table and swung it with both hands. Crash! The pitcher connected with the waiter's face just as he lunged. The sound of breaking glass and breaking bone echoed through the gallery. The waiter screamed, the ceramic knife flying from his hand and skittering across the floor, landing at Nikolai's feet. Blood sprayed across the white tablecloth, speckling Lorenzo's pristine shirt. The music stopped. Silence slammed into the room. Lorenzo was on his feet in a microsecond, his own gun drawn from a holster at the small of his back, aimed instantly at Nikolai. "Traitor!" Lorenzo roared. Nikolai's bodyguards drew their weapons. Marco and the Valenti men drew theirs. Suddenly the charity gala was a Mexican standoff with 40 guns drawn. "I did not order this!" Nikolai shouted, holding his hands up, his face pale. He looked down at the ceramic knife. "This is not my man!" The waiter was writhing on the floor, clutching his ruined face. Sarah stood over him, breathing hard, a shard of the glass pitcher still clutched in her hand like a dagger. Lorenzo looked at the waiter, then at the knife, and finally at Sarah. He saw the blood on her dress. He saw the tactical boots on the waiter. He realized in a split second how close he had come to having his throat slit. "Stand down!" Lorenzo barked to his men, though he didn't lower his gun. "Check the waiter." Marco rushed forward, kicking the waiter in the ribs to flip him over. He ripped the waiter's shirt open. There, tattooed on the waiter's chest, was not the symbol of the Kovac syndicate, and not the Valenti crest. It was a black serpent eating its own tail. A collective gasp went through the older men in the room. "Ouroboros," Nikolai whispered, looking genuinely terrified. "The third faction." Lorenzo's face went hard as stone. This wasn't a turf war anymore. This was an invasion by a ghost enemy that wasn't supposed to exist. He lowered his gun slowly, his eyes locking onto Sarah. She was shaking now, the adrenaline fading, leaving the cold reality of violence in its wake. Lorenzo walked over to her. He didn't check the waiter. He didn't yell at Nikolai. He took his tuxedo jacket off and draped it over Sarah's shoulders, covering the bloodstains on her dress. "You missed a spot," Sarah whispered, pointing to a speck of blood on his cheek. Lorenzo reached out, his thumb brushing her jawline, wiping away a stray droplet of water. "You saved the king," Lorenzo said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "That makes you a queen, Sarah. And queens, they never get to leave the board." He turned to the room, his arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against him. "This meeting is over," Lorenzo announced. "We have a war to plan." As they walked out of the Art Institute, flanked by a wall of armed men, Sarah looked back. Nikolai was staring at her, not with hatred, but with calculation. She had just exposed a new enemy, saved the most powerful man in Chicago, and proven herself to be more dangerous than any soldier in the room. The test was over. The game had just begun. The drive from the Art Institute was a blur of rain and sirens. Lorenzo didn't take Sarah back to her apartment in Cicero. He didn't take her to the Obsidian. The convoy of black SUVs wove through the city, taking erratic turns to shake any tails, before disappearing into the underground parking garage of a nondescript steel and glass tower in the loop. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked. She was still wearing Lorenzo's tuxedo jacket. It smelled of gunpowder and expensive cologne, a scent she was beginning to associate with safety. "The bunker," Lorenzo replied. "My penthouse is compromised. If Ouroboros could get a waiter into that gala, they can get a delivery boy into my building. Tonight, we go off the grid." The bunker was a cold, modernist apartment on the 40th floor with bulletproof windows and a dedicated server room. It wasn't a home. It was a command center. Lorenzo dismissed his men at the door, keeping only Marco stationed in the hallway. Once the heavy steel door clicked shut, the adrenaline finally left the room, leaving behind a heavy, exhausting silence. Lorenzo walked to the kitchen island and poured 2 stiff drinks. His hands, usually steady as stone, had a slight tremor. Not from fear, Sarah realized. From rage. "Ouroboros," Lorenzo muttered, sliding a glass of bourbon across the marble counter to her. "They were a myth, A ghost story old gangsters told to scare the new blood. They were supposed to be wiped out in the 90s. My father talked about them once, Sarah said quietly, taking the drink. Lorenzo froze. The janitor? What did he say? He said they weren't a family, Sarah recalled, the memory surfacing through the haze of her childhood. He said they were a broker system. They didn't sell drugs or run protection rackets. They sold information. Betrayal. If you wanted a boss killed, you called them. If you wanted a route burned, you called them. They have no loyalty, only contracts. Lorenzo slammed his hand on the counter. That assassin. The waiter. He had a phone. Marco took it off the body. But it's military-grade encryption. Biometric lock. Sarah set her drink down. Give it to me. Lorenzo looked at her. Sarah, this isn't pouring drinks. This is digital forensics. I told you, I have a life outside the club, she said, her voice even. I know Python. I know encryption protocols. My father didn't just teach me how to clean blood. He taught me how to scrub hard drives. If that phone has a weakness, I'll find it. Lorenzo studied her for a long moment. The dynamic between them had shifted. She wasn't his employee anymore. She was his equal. He reached into his pocket and slid a cracked smartphone across the counter. You have 1 hour, he said, before I call in the specialists. Sarah didn't need an hour. She needed 40 minutes. She connected the phone to a laptop in the safe room, bypassing the biometric lock by booting the device in recovery mode and running a brute force script against the PIN backup. It was messy, but effective. Got it, she announced. Lorenzo was at her shoulder instantly. What is it? It's a hit order, Sarah said, scrolling through the decrypted text messages, but it wasn't sent from the outside. She felt the blood drain from her face. She turned the laptop screen toward Lorenzo. The message on the assassin's phone read, Target, Lorenzo Valenti. Location, Art Institute. Payment, transferred. Sender, redacted. That's standard, Lorenzo said, frowning. Look at the timestamp, Sarah pointed. The order was sent at 7:45 p.m., 10 minutes after we arrived at the gala. And look at the attachment. It was a photo of Lorenzo and Sarah entering the building, taken from inside the venue. The call is coming from inside the house, Sarah whispered. Someone in your inner circle sent the signal. They confirmed your location. They marked you. Lorenzo's face went dark. A terrifying transformation took place. The sophisticated businessman vanished, replaced by the predator who ruled Chicago. Who knew we were going to the gala? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Me, Sarah listed. Marco. And Giovanni, Lorenzo finished. Giovanni, the consigliere, the old man who had served Lorenzo's father, the man who had raised Lorenzo after his parents died. It was unthinkable. It was impossible. And yet the data didn't lie. Lorenzo pulled out his own phone. He dialed a number. Giovanni, Lorenzo said, his voice cheerful, masking the fury beneath. The gala was a disaster. I need you. Meet me at the warehouse in District 4, alone. We need to plan a counterstrike. He hung up and looked at Sarah. You're staying here, he ordered. No, Sarah stood up. I found the rat. I'm coming with you to set the trap. It's too dangerous. You said I passed the test, Sarah challenged him, stepping close, her eyes blazing. You said I was a queen on the board. You don't leave the queen in the box when the game gets hard. Lorenzo looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the fire that matched his own. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of her neck, his thumb brushing her pulse point. The tension in the room spiked, electric and dangerous. If you come, he whispered, there is no going back to the diner, Sarah. After tonight, you are Valenti blood. You are mine. Sarah didn't flinch. I was never really a waitress, Lorenzo. He kissed her. It wasn't soft. It was a seal of a dark pact. Get your coat, he said, pulling away. We have a traitor to kill. The warehouse in District 4 was a rusting hulk of iron and corrugated steel, a relic of Chicago's industrial past. Rain hammered against the metal roof, creating a deafening drumbeat that that masked the sound of footsteps. Lorenzo and Sara waited in the shadows of the catwalk, 20 feet above the ground floor. Marco and 4 trusted soldiers were hidden behind crates below. At 2 a.m., a lone car pulled into the bay. The headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Giovanni stepped out. He was an elderly man, using a cane, dressed in an impeccably tailored beige overcoat. He looked like a grandfather, harmless and frail. He walked to the center of the warehouse. "Lorenzo," he called out. "I'm here." Lorenzo stepped out onto the catwalk, looking down like a vengeful god. "Hello, Uncle," Lorenzo's voice echoed. Giovanni looked up, squinting. "Why are we up there? Come down, Enzo. We have business." "We do," Lorenzo called back. "I want to talk about the Art Institute. I want to talk about how the assassin knew exactly where I was standing." Giovanni paused. He leaned on his cane. "We have leaks, Enzo. I told you this. The organization is porous. The leak isn't porous, Giovanni. It's a flood, and it's coming from your phone." Lorenzo signaled Marco. Below, the soldiers emerged from the shadows, guns trained on the old man. Giovanni didn't panic. He didn't beg. He simply sighed, a sound of deep disappointment. He straightened up, and suddenly, the frailty vanished. He tossed the cane aside. He didn't need it. "I told your father you were too sentimental," Giovanni said, his voice changing, losing its warmth. "You think loyalty is a currency. It's not. It's a shackle." "Why?" Lorenzo asked, the pain audible in his voice. "You raised me. And you grew up to be a dinosaur," Giovanni spat. "The families are dying, Enzo. The old ways, honor, territory, omerta. It's bad for business. Ouroboros, they are the future. Corporate crime. No borders, no names. Just profit. They offered me the city. All I had to do was remove the obstacle." "I'm the obstacle," Lorenzo stated. "You are the past." Giovanni snapped his fingers. Sara, watching from the catwalk, felt a shift in the air. Her eyes darted to the shadows behind Marco and the loyal soldiers. "Lorenzo!" she screamed. "The crates!" It was too late. The shipping crates surrounding Marco and the soldiers burst open. Men in tactical gear, mercenaries, not mobsters, poured out. They were Ouroboros kill squads. The ambush had been ambushed. Gunfire erupted instantly. It was a massacre. 2 of Lorenzo's men went down in the first second. Marco roared, flipping a table for cover, returning fire with dual pistols. "Get down!" Lorenzo tackled Sara on the catwalk as bullets sparked against the railing where she had been standing. "We're trapped!" Sara yelled over the noise. "The roof!" Lorenzo shouted. "There's a fire escape!" They scrambled along the catwalk, bullets pinging off the metal grating beneath their feet. Below, the battle was chaotic. Giovanni was walking calmly through the crossfire towards the exit, protected by the Ouroboros mercenaries. Lorenzo stopped. He looked down at Giovanni, then at the exit, then at Marco, who was pinned down and taking heavy fire. "Go!" Lorenzo shoved Sara towards the ladder. "Get to the car!" "What are you doing?" "I'm not leaving my men." Lorenzo vaulted over the railing, dropping 20 feet onto a stack of pallets below. He rolled, came up shooting, and took out 2 mercenaries flanking Marco. "Boss!" Marco yelled, bleeding from a shoulder wound. "Get out of here!" "Not without you!" Lorenzo roared, firing his Glock until it clicked empty, then reloading with a speed that blurred the eye. Sara stood at the top of the ladder. Logic told her to run. The calm waitress would run. But Serafina Moretti... She didn't run. She saw Giovanni reaching the bay door. He was getting away. If he escaped, the war would never end. Sara looked around. She saw the control panel for the overhead crane. It was an old industrial magnet system. She rushed to the panel. It was rusted, the labels faded. She didn't need labels. She slammed the lever forward. With a groan of stressing metal, the massive overhead crane lurched into motion. The heavy electromagnet swung wildly, dangling on a thick chain directly over the bay doors. Giovanni was stepping out into the rain. Sarah jammed the button for mag on. Nothing happened. The power was cut. "Come on," she hissed, smashing the emergency override. Below, a mercenary spotted her. "Girl on the roof!" Bullets tore through the control booth, shattering the glass. Sarah ducked, covering her head as shards rained down. She reached up blindly and slammed her fist onto the drop-release lever instead. The heavy steel hook block, weighing 2 tons, detached from the magnet housing. It fell. It didn't hit Giovanni. Sarah's aim wasn't that perfect. But it crashed into the concrete directly in front of his car, smashing the engine block of his getaway vehicle and sending concrete shrapnel flying. The explosion of force knocked Giovanni off his feet. The distraction was enough. The Ouroboros mercenaries faltered, looking at the blocked exit. Lorenzo saw the opening. "Push!" he screamed to Marco. They advanced, a wall of lead cutting down the mercenaries who were now scrambling without an exit plan. Lorenzo reached Giovanni. The old man was on the ground, dazed, coughing in the dust. Lorenzo stood over him, breathing hard, his suit torn, his face splattered with grime. He aimed his gun at the man who had been his father. "The future is cancelled, Giovanni," Lorenzo said. "Do it!" Giovanni wheezed, looking up with hateful eyes. "Kill me! Another head will grow. You can't stop the snake." Bang! Lorenzo didn't hesitate. He ended it. Silence returned to the warehouse, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the relentless rain on the roof. Lorenzo looked up at the catwalk. The control booth was riddled with bullet holes. "Sarah!" he screamed, panic cracking his voice for the first time. "Sarah!" There was no answer. Lorenzo ran. He scrambled up the ladder, ignoring the burning in his lungs. He kicked open the door to the control booth. Sarah was sitting on the floor, leaning against the console. Her face was pale. She was holding her side. Blood was seeping through the black silk of the dress he had bought her. "Did we win?" she whispered, her voice thready. Lorenzo fell to his knees beside her, his hands hovering over the wound, terrified to touch her, terrified to hurt her more. "We won," he choked out. "We won, Piccola. Stay with me. Marco, get the car. Now!" Sarah smiled, a faint, weak thing. I guess I finally flinched." Her eyes rolled back and she slumped against his chest. Lorenzo Valenti, the man who never felt anything, let out a scream that tore through the warehouse, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. He scooped her up in his arms, holding her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. He had won the battle, but he was about to find out that the war for her life was the only fight that counted. The relentless, rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor was the only sound that had existed in Lorenzo Valenti's world for 48 agonizing hours. It was a sterile, mechanical metronome, counting down the seconds between life and death. Lorenzo sat in a hard, molded plastic chair in the corner of the intensive care unit at St. Jude's Hospital. He was a ruin of a man. He hadn't showered, he hadn't eaten. He was still wearing the same bespoke tuxedo shirt from the warehouse, now stiff with dried blood and grime, the cuffs unbuttoned and rolled up to his elbows. His jaw was dark with stubble, and his eyes were rimmed with red, burning with an exhaustion he refused to acknowledge. The hospital staff was terrified of him. A head nurse had tried to enforce visiting hours on the first night, citing protocol. She had been met not by Lorenzo, but by Marco, who was stationed outside the door like a gargoyle. Marco had quietly informed the hospital administrator that Mr. Valenti had personally funded the new pediatric wing 3 years ago, and if he were forced to leave this room, that funding, and the hospital's electrical grid, might experience unexpected complications. No one disturbed him after that. Lorenzo held Sarah's hand. Her skin was terrifyingly pale, almost translucent under the harsh fluorescent lights, making the dark bruising along her side stand out in stark, violent contrast. IV lines snaked into her arm like blue veins, pumping fluids and antibiotics into her system. He squeezed her fingers, desperate for a response, staring at her chest as it rose and fell in shallow, assisted breaths. "You don't get to die," he whispered, his voice raspy. broken by the smoke and screaming of the last 2 days. "I didn't hire you to die, Sarah. That wasn't in the contract." It was a command, issued with the last shreds of his authority. But in the quiet of the room, it sounded more like a prayer to a god he didn't believe in. When her eyes finally fluttered open, it was 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. It was the exact time she used to clock out of her shift at the Obsidian, back when her biggest worry was sore feet and a grumpy manager. She blinked rapidly, struggling to focus as she adjusted to the light. A groan of pain escaped her lips as she tried to shift, the movement pulling at the stitches that held her side together. Lorenzo was out of the chair instantly. He leaned over the rail, his face hovering inches from hers. "Sarah?" She turned her head slowly. Her eyes were glassy, drugged, but they found him. She squeezed his hand back. It was a weak, tremulous grip, but to Lorenzo, it felt stronger than iron. "You look terrible," she rasped, her voice sounding like it had been dragged over gravel. Lorenzo let out a breath that shuddered through his entire body, a sound dangerously close to a sob. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles, his composure finally cracking. The mask of the Don slipped, revealing the terrified man beneath. "You took a bullet for me, Sarah. You jumped in front of a kill squad." "I was aiming for the crane controls," she murmured, a faint, lopsided smile touching her pale lips. "I think I panicked. My aim was off. You saved my life. Again." Lorenzo brushed a strand of damp hair back from her forehead, his touch uncharacteristically gentle. "Why, you could have run. You should have run." Sarah looked at the ceiling, then back at him. The drugs were making her heavy, pulling her back towards sleep, but she fought them for one more moment. "Because," she whispered, her eyelids drooping, "I didn't want the job to end. No, I don't like unfinished puzzles." 3 months later. The Chicago skyline was draped in winter mist, but the lights of the city burned brighter than ever. The Obsidian was gone, the sign had been taken down, the velvet ropes removed. In its place, a new establishment had risen from the ashes of the old regime. The sign above the heavy steel doors simply read, "The Vault." It was more exclusive, more secure, and impossible to get into unless you were vetted, scanned, and on the list. It wasn't just a nightclub anymore. It was a fortress of commerce and influence. The heavy oak doors swung open, and Sarah walked in. She wasn't wearing an apron stained with grenadine. She was wearing a tailored white power suit, cut sharp enough to draw blood. Her hair, once tied back in a messy bun, was now a sleek, sharp bob that framed her face. Around her neck sat a diamond necklace that shimmered under the recessed lighting, a gift from Lorenzo. It wasn't jewelry. It was a collar, a declaration to the city that she belonged to the Valenti throne, and the throne belonged to her. The club was humming with low jazz and the murmur of power brokers. Sarah walked past the bar, her heels clicking with authority on the polished floor. The new bartender, a young kid named Leo, who reminded her faintly of her younger self, froze as she approached. He straightened his vest and nodded respectfully. "Evening, Mrs. Valenti." She paused, resting a manicured hand on the mahogany counter. "Good evening, Leo. The meeting has started?" "Yes, ma'am. They're waiting for you." "Good." She leaned in slightly. "Send in the water. 3 ice cubes, not 4. Not 2. Don't forget." "Never, ma'am." She walked towards the back office, the room she used to fear entering. Now she opened the door without knocking. Lorenzo was behind the massive ebony desk, bathed in the glow of a tablet screen. He was reviewing the monthly ledgers, a frown of concentration on his face. He looked healthier now, the circles under his eyes gone, the tension in his shoulders replaced by a lethal confidence. When she entered, he didn't just look up. He stood up. "Grandma Rose?" he asked immediately. "She settled in the villa," Sarah said, walking over to the decanter on the side table. "I just got off the phone with the head nurse. She's complaining that the Swiss air is too clean and the nurses are too polite. She misses the noise of the L train." We can bring her back, Lorenzo offered, his voice sincere. I can have the penthouse soundproofed. No, Sarah said, pouring herself a drink. She's safe there. We're safe here. That's the trade. She walked over to him and sat on the edge of his desk, crossing her legs. She picked up the ledger he was reading. The Ouroboros accounts? Gone, Lorenzo said simply, leaning back in his leather chair. While you were recovering, Marco and we did some deep cleaning. We tracked their broker to a shell company in Miami. We found their offshore accounts in the Caymans. We didn't just kill the snake, Sarah. We starved it. The third faction is history. Sarah nodded, satisfied. She reached out and straightened his silk tie, her fingers lingering on the knot. You know, she said softly, her eyes searching his. People are talking. The whispers on the street. They say Lorenzo Valenti went soft. They say he lost his edge because he married a waitress. Lorenzo chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. He stood and stepped between her knees, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her flush against him. The heat between them was palpable, a mix of romance and shared trauma. Let them talk, he whispered against her ear. Let them think I'm soft. They don't know the truth. And what is the truth, Mr. Valenti? The truth is that the waitress is the one holding the gun, he said, his dark eyes locking onto hers. They don't know that you are the dangerous one, Piccola. He kissed her then, deep and slow. It wasn't the tentative kiss of a new romance. It was the kiss of two survivors, two predators who had found the only other person in the world who understood the darkness required to keep the light on. He pulled back, checking his watch. Are you ready? The commission is waiting in the boardroom, the heads of the 5 families. They want to meet the new consigliere. Sarah smiled. It was the same calm, unshakable smile she had worn the night she held a loaded revolver to his forehead. Let's go, she said, sliding off the desk and smoothing her jacket. I think they're thirsty. She took his arm, her grip firm and steady. Together they walked out of the office, past the guards, and into the heart of their kingdom. The waitress who didn't flinch had become the queen who didn't bow, and Lorenzo Valenti, the man who was once said to have a calculator for a heart, had finally found the one variable he couldn't solve, and the only one he was willing to bleed for. And that is how a 23-year-old waitress brought the most dangerous man in Chicago to his knees. Not with a weapon, but with sheer, undeniable nerve. Sarah didn't just survive the mafia. She conquered it. It's a reminder that sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one shouting orders or holding the gun. It's the one who stays calm when the world is burning down. What about you? If you were in Sarah's shoes with a gun to your head and $10,000 on the table, would you have pulled the trigger, or would you have walked away? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal, romance, and power, please smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.